Hungry. That is where Ruth and Naomi are as we start the second chapter. And I'm not talking like Snickers commercial hungry, like you're not yourself when you're hungry. I'm talking hungry like where is our next meal going to come from? Hungry. How are we going to make it? Hungry. Ruth's commitment to Naomi in chapter 1, though admirable and heartfelt, where you go, I'll go, your people will be my people, it now has some serious practical implications. They have no means and no prospects besides the hope of some distant relatives, which Naomi makes reference to, but there is no real connection. And while Ruth's commitment and devotion to Naomi is admirable, in Israel she will be known as the Moabite. Ruth the Moabite, as she is always referred. Moab is a problem. The land of Moab is just east of the Dead Sea. It's a largely agricultural stretch of land that borders Israel. Today it is the far western part of the nation of Jordan. It's right on the border. Moab is the land where Moses, after leading Israel out of Egypt through the Red Sea past Mount Sinai, 40 years of wandering the wilderness, well, they came to Moab and conquered the city of Sihon before they could then make their way into the land that God had promised. And as Moses handed the reins on to Joshua, he would continue to struggle with the people in Moab. And as the judges then took control, they would continue to struggle with the people in Moab. And as the story of Ruth began, in the day when the judges ruled Israel, we're right in the time when Moab and Israel were primary rivals. But there's something I want to spell out a little more clearly. While Moab is definitely a rival, they are political and even religious foes. That is, the kings and the leaders of Moab would struggle with Israel for generations. Also, one of Moab's largest cities, Beth Peor, which is right over the border, it was a prominent religious cult site. And the people of Israel would repeatedly be influenced to worship idols at that site. But there's even something else. While Moab is a rival, there is also a sense that these rivals are relatives. Moab is believed to have begun through Lot's daughter. Lot's daughter had a son named Moab. And Lot, of course, was the brother of Abraham. So you go back to the beginning of Genesis here. And Lot and his wife were in Sodom and Gomorrah. And when God rained down fire, they fled. But God said, don't turn around and look, or you'll be turned into a pillar of salt. Well, Lot's wife turned around and looked, turned into a pillar of salt. So then Lot had these two daughters, and they said, oh no, we'll never get married. How will we have children? So they got their father drunk. Sorry, this is the PG-13 part of my sermon. And they took advantage of him, and they had children. Now, this is not an episode of the Game of Thrones that I'm reporting to you. This is the Bible, okay? The point being, Moab, the Moabites, those people are messed up. It is a strange, weird place. They are rivals, they're bad people, and Ruth, the Moabite, now has to find a way to care for herself and her mother-in-law, to whom she has committed herself. Well, since she has to do something after consulting with Naomi, she decides to do what all widows and destitute people do. She will go and glean in the fields. And gleaning is going through the fields at harvest time, and whatever grain is missed by the farmers and the harvesters, that's the grain that she would get, and hopefully they would have enough to live on. Well, she happens to pick the field belonging to Boaz, and Boaz is this distant relative to which Naomi referred earlier. And as the story is written, it's purely a coincidence. Ruth had no idea which field she was picking. It just happened to be the right one. But as Catherine Schifferdecker, professor of Old Testament at Luther Seminary, says, a coincidence is a miracle in which God prefers to remain anonymous. And this is the part of the story I love the most. Boaz comes from his home in Bethlehem out to his fields, and he notices somebody new right away. I like to think Ruth was smoking hot. Soon as he walked out there, he's like, who is that? gleaning in my field, right? And there's Ruth, and he sees, and of course he wants to know about this woman, so he gets the full story about Naomi and leaving Moab and who she is and where she's from, but he sees how committed she is, and he is attracted to her. What transpires in this happy coincidence turns out to be something special for Ruth and for Boaz. He invites her to lunch, and that's what John just read a little bit ago, is their interaction during this lunch, where Boaz generously welcomes this outsider, this foreigner, this Moabite. He praises her devotion to Naomi, her determination to make things work, and her efforts in the field, gleaning from early on and never taking a break. And he even prays God's rich blessings upon her. His words, "May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." And what's important is Boaz welcomes her fully with God's blessing, and then he becomes the answer to the prayer and blessing that he invoked. He invites Ruth to continue to glean in his field under the protection of his people. And he even tells his workers to leave full sheaves of grain for her to collect. At the end of the day, Ruth the Moabite had gleaned about an ephah of grain. That's what it says in the text. An ephah is about 30 pounds of grain. So if you've ever purchased a 5-pound bag of flour, you get an idea of it was a good day picking barley. So she goes home and tells Naomi about the grain, gives her also the leftover lunch, which Boaz sent home, and tells her this important news about Boaz. And Naomi knew exactly who Boaz was, her distant relative, the kinsman redeemer, as we saw in the video. And that important title will play out in chapter 4, 2 weeks from today. Naomi knows that Boaz is absolutely the answer to their prayer. And after the tragedy of chapter 1, things could not have gone better for her and Ruth. As the chapter closes, we hear that Ruth finished out the harvest season, going to the fields every day under Boaz's protection and with his blessing. This is a story of an outsider welcomed. An outsider who found a place. We experienced that on our mission trip, and I want to address this just a little bit today. In a few weeks, on the 26th of August, the mission trip group will present a full report in church, but the way our trip out to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation started was this. In my previous congregation, I led the youth group, and we did mission trips. And we did 2 in a row, one in Arizona, one in Georgia. And you do those short-term mission trips, and at the end of a week of work, you say to the people that you've been working with, "Have a nice life." And we felt like, it's been great and fulfilling, but what if we really tried to dig into this, what Jesus says, love your neighbor, and find a place to really commit, and at the end of the week say, "See you next year." So I reached out some feelers and got 3 different options for my youth group and said, "Where do you want to go to start this relationship?" A long-term thing. And they chose South Dakota, Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, because there was a retired Lutheran pastor with connections on the res, and we could get connected. So I called this retired pastor, and he said, "I've retired and moved to Utah. Good luck." Pursued some other options. There was a teacher at the high school with some connections out there, and he put me in touch with the Catholic Church there. So I called Father Rick at Our Lady of Sorrows Catholic Church in Kyle. And I said, "This is what we're doing. This is who we are." And he said, "There's no way I can host a group that size, but I know who can." Her name is Rose Frazier, and he gave me her contact information. And by coincidence, we connected with Rose. And the adage holds true. A coincidence is one of those miracles that God prefers to remain anonymous. The first year that our group went out there was 7 years ago. And the first couple of years, Our hosts were pretty guarded. Not exactly the most trusting folks, because Native Americans and white folks have a fairly tenuous history if you know anything about it. But even the second year, I remember walking into the youth center, and as soon as Rose saw my face, you could see the recognition. You're back. That doesn't usually happen. People don't usually come back. But by the third and the fourth year, it was truly a profound friendship that was forming. And as our group went and experienced this summer, we were welcomed really as friends right away, as family. And we experienced certain things that you don't get to experience unless you are truly an insider there. And I would love to tell you more, but I'm going to save it for the group on the 26th. You'll have to hear the end of it then. But the res, it's a rough place. If you read anything about it, you know 90% unemployment. Over half of the folks have addiction issues, poor nutrition, etc. But what we experienced was hope. What is born in those relationships is hope. And in the second chapter of the story of Ruth today, as she and Naomi went forward, what Ruth and Naomi discovered was hope. They begin to see the glimmer that things might actually change for them. And what's also born in this chapter is love. Boaz knows that Ruth is much more than a poor beggar. And Ruth sees Boaz as much more than that successful older relative. They are attracted to each other. Boaz for Ruth's loyalty toward her mother-in-law, and Ruth toward Boaz's generosity and kindness. And while it seems like a convenient relationship for each of them, there is genuine attraction here. The other part of this story that's worth noting is God's presence. God is not overwhelmingly present here. God is not in burning bushes or parting seas or giving super strength to Samsons or working other supernatural miracles. God is present in the everyday circumstance of ordinary people. God's chesed is found in the faithfulness of Boaz and Ruth. And in fact, the words that Naomi uses are very telling. When Ruth reports to her that Boaz and his instructions for her for that day and the rest of the season, Naomi says these words, "Blessed be he, Boaz, by the Lord, whose chesed has not forsaken the living or the dead." And chesed, again, is loving kindness, devotion, unconditional caring and generosity. Chesed, there's no good translation for it. But whose chesed is she referring to? Blessed be he, by the Lord, whose chesed. Is it Boaz's or the Lord's? Or are they one and the same? The chesed of God is the chesed of Boaz. God's chesed is embodied by God's people, and that is our journey of faith. To grow in love for God, that we become the love and faithfulness of God for the world. Boaz and Ruth will soon discover that the miracle of God unfolding in this story will be one of their own making. Sometimes we get to participate in God's miracles. And as we continue through this story, I hope we can continue to feel like we know these people. We know Naomi. We know people who have experienced tragedy, who are lonely and lost in grief, who feel powerless, but who have a certain wisdom and wit through it all. And maybe you are Naomi. We know Ruth, feisty and loyal, ready to dig in and work like crazy, a strong and faithful person who refuses to quit even when they have every reason to give up. Maybe you are Ruth. We know Boaz, the salt of the earth, generous and successful person who recognizes the good in others even when nobody else does. Maybe you are Boaz. These are ordinary people. These people are us. This is our story. It's messy, it's complicated, and filled with heartbreak and loss. The people in this story are flawed, but we can see how God's spark can ignite at just the right moment. We see how hope is born, how love grows. Next week, into chapter 3, we'll see that love can take us to some unexpected places, and the relationships we form can move us into situations we would never imagine. But that's why love is truly a miracle.